"Miss Mackenzie," he said politely, "is this how you do business?" "Who are you to teach me how to do business?" Karina replied sharply. "Don't be rude to me. Pay your bill and get lost." The crowd of people at the doorway was beginning to grow. A young man pushed through the crowd and into the room, causing Frazer to smile. Frazer poured himself another glass of the expensive red wine, took a large sip, and looked right into Karina's eyes. "I'll pay the bill," he said to Karina, "but you'll refuse to accept my money." Natalia looked at Frazer in surprise. "Are you crazy?" she whispered to him. "You've only just earned that money. Don't blow it." "What do you mean?" asked Karina. She stared at him from top to bottom with a disdainful look. "You do realize the size of this bill, don't you?" The young man from the doorway stepped forward, allowing Karina to notice him for the first time. "What's going on?" he asked. Karina smiled. The man was Scott Vieira, and he was her boss. She was looking forward to telling him about how she had secured such a huge commission for his restaurant, and she was convinced that he would back her up in her attempt to get the guests to pay. "These customers are refusing to pay," she said, looking at him. "They ordered dishes they can't afford." Scott looked at the party, his gaze landing on Frazer. "Are you sure they can't afford it?" he asked, turning back to Karina and fighting an urge to punch her. Had she been a man, he would have. "I don't think you recognize this man. Take a closer look," Scott ordered her. Karina looked at Scott, a puzzled expression on her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, confused. She was beginning to feel uncomfortable. "I mean, you're fired," he said, stony-faced. But... Karina was dumbstruck. Scott said nothing. He continued to glare at her. "Scott, are you crazy?" Karina cried, eventually finding her voice. "Do you know who I am? I'm a Mackenzie," she shouted. "Yes, I know," he replied. "I know you think you're from a family of aristocrats, which is why I can't afford to keep you on my payroll." He turned to Frazer and said, "Frazer." But Frazer interrupted him. "Thanks for coming to our rescue like this," he said. "It was a coincidence that I was able to help you recently, but I really appreciate that you've just returned the favor." Scott raised an eyebrow in surprise and confusion. He looked at Frazer's expression and, being quick-witted, immediately guessed what was going on. Scott walked over to him and offered him his hand, saying, "You're welcome. Although I can't believe you're friends with her," he added, nodding towards Sheila. The look on his face made it clear that he didn't like her. Sheila looked at Frazer and Scott in complete shock. How could Frazer Macklemore be friends with Scott Vieira? She thought cynically. She could see that Lynn was having similar thoughts, but Natalia didn't seem surprised at all. Frazer had told her that he saved his life in the past, but that was all she knew. Karina was still irate about her treatment at the hands of Scott. She wasn't prepared to be humiliated in such a way. "Scott, I don't know how you know this good-for-nothing, but I will not be treated like this. You know that our families go way back." "Oh, be quiet," shouted Scott. He had had enough of Karina and her excuses. "Have you forgotten that our families severed all ties a while back? Don't think I don't know what your family has been up to." A stunned silence descended upon the room. Are you sure you want to treat me like this?" asked Karina, determined not to go down without a fight. "I'm sure," he said, glaring at her. Seeing Scott's serious expression and the large number of people staring at her, Karina didn't reply. If she'd known that Frazer and Scott were friends, she would never have dreamed of trying such a stunt. She took a deep breath and nodded, preparing to leave. "Stop. Did I say you could leave the room?" asked Scott. "Pardon?" asked Karina incredulously. "What do you want? I thought you fired me." Scott looked at her, his face impassive. "Frazer, what do you think I should do with her?" he asked. Frazer looked at all the empty dishes on the table and smiled. "I think that since she ordered all these costly dishes, she should pay for them," he said. Karina's eyes opened wide and she said, "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "Do you know who I am? How dare you?" Scott looked at the manager who was still in the room. "Get the credit card machine," he said. The manager ran off to get the machine as Scott turned to the security guards. "Don't let this woman leave until she's settled her debt," he said to them. The guards smiled. Karina had never treated them with much respect in the past. It was a task they were going to enjoy. No one spoke as they waited for the manager to return. Karina glared at Scott. A few minutes earlier, she planned to call the police and have Natalia and her family arrested. Ironically, she was now in danger of being the one who was arrested. The manager returned with the card reader. Karina dug her card out of her pocket and slapped it on the machine in frustration. Scott smiled as the machine beeped, letting everyone in the room know she had just spent a fortune on a meal for 4 people she hated. "Thank you, Miss McKenzie," said Scott. "Now you may leave." Karina left, flanked by the security guards. She didn't utter another word while walking out in utter embarrassment. "Frazer, is there anything you'd like to tell me?" asked Natalia suspiciously. "You know, about you and Scott?" Frazer looked at her, wondering how to explain, but Scott beat him to it. He laughed and rolled his eyes. "Didn't he tell you?" he asked. "It was years ago when we were at college. Frazer and I went camping and I accidentally fell into an abandoned mine shaft. If Frazer hadn't pulled me out and carried me home, I would have died." Frazer smiled, thinking what a great screenwriter Scott might have been if he hadn't become a businessman instead. "Oh, I see," said Natalia. "He hadn't told me the details," she added, looking doubtful. She was sure that if Frazer really had saved Scott in the past, he would have bragged about it several times. Sheila, however, was much more impressed. Coupled with his handling of the affair with Karina, he was gaining merit points with her. They chatted with Scott for a few minutes longer before they left the restaurant, unaware that they were being watched by a gloomy-looking young person. Once they had left the parking lot, this young person dug out his cell phone and made a call. "I've sent you the money," he said once the call was answered. "You should make your move now. Make sure you get it right. If you do, I'll make it worth your while." There was a pause before a deep voice replied. "I understand," he said. "Just wait 2 days, okay?" As the car sped away from the restaurant, Frazer began to notice that Natalia, Lynn, and Sheila's opinions of him had risen a little. Sheila even joked with him that she would like him to help her secure a position at the Robster Corporation. Natalia interrupted before he could say anything. "Don't waste your time, Sheila," she said. "By now, the boss will already have forgotten about Frazier." Frazier smiled. "You're right," he said, glad he didn't have to elaborate. The next few days passed without incident. Natalia and Sheila went to work as usual, and Lynn returned to college for the week, planning to come home again for the weekend. Natalia was looking forward to Lynn's return. She left work early, planning to cook her favorite meal in celebration of her return. She set the table and laid all her carefully prepared dishes out on it, waiting for her noisy entrance. She smiled. She missed her sister. Whenever the younger one was home, she filled the house with her exuberant presence. As the dishes began to go cold, Natalia looked at her watch. Lynn was rarely late. She decided to call her and check whether she was okay. There was no reply. When Frazer walked in, he noticed that his wife looked worried. "What's happened?" he asked.
To watch the full episode, install the Pocket FM app